And we have to repeat that. So welcome everyone again, and thanks for coming. And we are here with this panel of inspiring speakers, Balas Para Todas, the female gaze in reporting on the Middle East and North Africa. So we will have a conversation based on this book. We'll show you now, edited by Lara Dictions and published in Spanish and in Spain. And we're trying to run a panel talking about, well, I can't say a female perspective of reporting, but the special taste of reporting in certain countries that we choose for many reasons that depends on many factors, and we try to do an immersive experience in these countries. So if you are a foreign correspondent or if you are a freelancer and you decide to stay based for many years in the region, which is completely different than going back and forth from that region often, or going there and just reporting for 10 days and then maybe going back to this place after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. So we have here a panel of speakers. Some of them are here in presence. One is online, and I'm going to present them. Natalia Sancha, which is the journalist who basically had the idea to put all these colleagues together. She's ex-Middle East correspondent for El País, and she's joining us from Brussels, I guess. And she will be online in video. And then starting from Nancy Borsia, freelance journalist. She covered for many years Libya for different media outlets and broadcasters. We have Maya Jebaili, Middle East correspondent for the Thomson Reuters Foundation, but now she changed for
Reuters.
For Reuters. She's based in Beirut, still in Beirut. And then Catalina Gomez Angel, freelance journalist, based, we can say, on 90% of the time of her life in Tehran, in Iran. So what is Balas Para Todas? It's a book written, each chapter is written by each member of this special crew. We have also other two speakers, two authors are not here with us, al-Jalal, which is a photographer from Egypt, and Habat Abbas, but we will talk about them later on, and Natalia will tell us something about their involvement in this publication. So basically, we try to define what could be the special way how to report from these particular regions, and staying based for years and trying also to deal with all these complex factors around the ground, the relation with people, with civilians, caring also about people that we cross during our reporting. So first of all, to give a kickoff of the panel, I just want to ask Natalia, who had the idea, why you decide to call all these remarkable colleagues and ask them to join you in this project, and why this project was needed in your perspective at that time.
Hi, Laura and colleagues. Thank you very much, and thank you for everyone who is interested, who is attending today. So the project was like roaming, let's say, in my head for a few years. And the idea came out of many trips in the Middle East. As you say, I was based in Beirut. And each time I was going to a front line or coming back from it, going to sleep into a hotel or any military base or whatever will have a rest. I was always crossing with my colleagues, and it's a moment that we always speak about what happened during the day, how we cover it, which was the perspective, which are the stories we deem was more important to recount that day. And I always, my conversation with my female colleagues were always pointing to another perspective, to another angle, who were more inclusive of the war. It was not only the front line, which normally on the Middle East is majoritarily held by men, but also was on the background, what was happening to women, what was happening to all the society who was staying behind and creating some oasis to survive, to create a normality. So for years, I was thinking about which will be the best way to convey what was happening and how the inclusion during the past decade, and I say decade because it was a decade so-called of the Arab Springs, so there was a lot of reprisals and conflicts happening in the region. How the inclusion of more and more freelance, mostly women journalists and also correspondents, were changing this narrative, not only among the role of women within those conflicts, but also about the war itself. Because by having access to women, we have to say that in the Middle East there is a segregation between male and female always, which is also affecting male reporters. They will be vetted from specific private areas, as will be refugee tents or houses where women are in it. So how the idea came on how to present those narratives who were given a specific angle for the role of woman in these conflicts, which is not only passive as we used to think, because we have the classical image of a woman crying next to a tent in a refugee camp. But because we had access to this 50% of the population, we discovered the women who were fighting, be it with armies, militias, or simply civilians taking up arms. We have those who were like committing or participating in crimes, like the woman who joined ISIS, them local, regional, or even from Europe. We have a lot of other roles who were not explored before of this woman. So that was mainly the main idea, how to convey it. And then I started thinking who will be the best colleagues, companions to do that. And for me, it was very important to have the presence of both. Those colleagues who have been living, who are foreigners, but have been living in, as it was my case, for over a decade in the region, because we have this in-depth view, this familiarity with what happened daily and how the nuance, how small changes are happening. And also, was very important for me, and maybe this makes it different from other available uh, books on the subject, which is to include also our local colleagues, because normally we have the recount either of foreign correspondent, either or local, but we don't have this contrast to see the perspective from both sides. And in this case, we have half 50% who are foreigners living for over a decade in the region, and the other are local colleagues. So, other than this consideration, for me, it was important also to bring testimonies from different supports, because it's not the same when you are in a TV. It's the case of Catalina, when you are accompanied by a crowd with the camera, it's more visible. Sometimes it can be even more risky. It's not the same to be a fixer and encounter the difficulties as being a fixer, as is the case of our colleague Khabat Abbas, and not the same to be a photographer or written press. So for me, the idea was to bring colleagues who are professional in different supports of the media, to bring also the difficulties to point and to shed some lights on the specific difficulties we're also finding depending of which kind of media we're working for. Um, Other than this, I also decided to do it in Spanish because unfortunately, most of the coverage of the region is done in English, and is the one who is prevalent on the social media, and it doesn't honor somehow all the wonderful foreign correspondents who are there, who are not from English speaking from media or outlets. So for me, it was important, although we're looking forward for translation into other languages, notably English or Italian, but that was important to have it. And the wonderful ladies you have around you are colleagues for this past decade that we have crossed. At least I've had crossed with all of them. They didn't know each other before embarking in this adventure that I have to say it happened during pandemia. But it worked very nicely, and we managed not only to write down this to share our experience, who are a very honest sharing of our experience, but also to identify many common shared difficulties and solutions, because it's not always only about the difficulties. We try to provide also how we try to manage to go around of all these obstacles we encounter in our way to bring the testimonies from the Middle East and North Africa.
Thank you, Natalia. So, listening to you, I thought that sometimes books written by women about journalists, women reporters working in conflict zones, or not even conflict zones, but in certain environments, look something like, okay, we are here to save the world, we are heroes. And what I really like of this book is that this is not the perspective. This is not the way all these professionals, they are looking to the places where they are working and the people they are meeting every day. But in somehow, and this is a question that sometimes I ask myself, in somehow we live between, if we want to use some categories, they are always used between East and West. Sometimes when I lived in Yemen, I said, okay, maybe there are two Laura's, you know, a kind of schizophrenic way of starting thinking about yourself, or, so I have a question for Carolina, because Carolina comes from the south of the world, right? And this is something interesting, we can say, but, you know, is this kind of schizophrenic way of dealing with ourselves? Or, I mean, the question is how a journalist could not be trapped into this mechanism and can stay in balance. I mean, first in the judgment, not being biased or trying to drag all the reporting to biases from the professional side. And from the personal side, the identity side, you know, you bring all these identities into you, and how you can deal with that.
It's the big deal of this, actually. I think I have like three lives. One, the South American life, the only other one, the European. At the end of the day, I work for a European newspaper and television. And the other one is my Eastern or Iranian, especially, life. Then it's dealing with that. And I always believe that after more than 12 years living in Iran, most of my time, covering Middle East, but based in Iran, I still have to explain every day what is Middle East, what is Iran, and especially what is to be women in the Middle East, to be women in Iran, and to try to break all these stereotypes of what is about women. Because, of course, there is the law against women, all the repression, all the government, all the laws trying to put the women aside, but we have also all these women trying to break these laws, trying to break these barriers. And also there are many things also in the laws and the societies of each country, especially in Iran, that is very complex to explain. For example, the participation of women in the education and the university, in the social life. And I feel that after so many years, I still have to explain that every day, and it's part of my schizophrenia. But at the same time, I have to explain there who I am. I'm not just a Western woman journalist trying to understand this country, trying to tell this country, not just the political side, also the society, but at the same time, I have to explain them why a Latin American woman wants to be there, and why makes me as the same important as European, because in certain ways, for certain people, I'm not saying for all the society, one thing is to be a European journalist, another thing is to be a Latin American journalist, and they put Latin Americans in all the same. I mean, Venezuelans are the same as Colombians, Colombians the same as Argentinians. That, of course, our political spectrum is totally different. Then it's very complicated and also very passionate, because you start the day, like, again, I start from zero every day, and you have to also to earn their trust every day from one side onto another. And this is trying not to be biased, trying to tell the story as it is, as more professional and more balanced as is possible. Not always is easy, and it's the way we try to do it, basically.
We try to do it, and you're doing it every day. And this is the professional side, you can say, but what I really like as a woman is that maybe it's the way we were raised in societies. In general, we are not scared about our emotions, to show our emotions or to admit that we have certain emotions. Sometimes we keep this inside, but sometimes we try a way to flow it out of ourselves. So, living for a long time, not only in a workplace, but, for example, I'm thinking regarding Maya and also Natalia, living for a long place in Beirut, a city that we never expected to see, that horrible blast we saw. It's a profound bound it's a deep bound into all the population, all the people that loved Beirut and lived there. We have to deal with our emotions. This was a big one, right? So we have to let them flow, and also we should manage them. But maybe the best way is don't have to fear them. So what's the balance also here between strength and fear? Now I'm going deeply, right?
Thanks so much for the question. It's pretty surreal to see a group of people here listening to us talk about this book, because it really was such a kind of labor of love that we put together over the course of the pandemic, basically. So it's pretty surreal to be here with you guys and to be speaking about this. On the subject of emotions, there's so many different kind of phases that we go through. I mean, I'll address the explosion first, I think, because it was a total fluke that I was in Beirut at the time. I was working in Baghdad. I was in Beirut on my first break after 5 months of lockdown in Iraq, where the airports were closed. So I ended up flying to Beirut a couple of days before the explosion, spent a couple of days in the mountains doing my confinement, and then headed down to Beirut on August 4th to see friends. And I had covered some explosions in Beirut in 2013. It was a very tense time. It became kind of expected that there would be explosions in certain neighborhoods of the southern suburbs of Beirut. But in my head, there was a pandemic. Iraq is the place that I was covering violence. Syria was the place that I'd covered violence. And so to have that happen in Beirut at a time where psychologically I was thinking, this is where I'm coming to take a breather, it still leaves me speechless. I mean, I was trying to get money out of the bank at the time, at the ATM, and when the explosion went off, and so my first thought was, somebody blew up the bank because they won't let us take our money out of the banks because of the financial crisis. So that was my understanding, was somebody must have blown up the bank. So it took me a bit of time to kind of really come to terms with the fact that a city that I'd considered relatively safe, a city that was my home, could be that affected. And I think I'm still, it comes in pieces, it comes in waves, like dealing with the idea that your home and the place that you had seen as your refuge, your place where you come back to after you cover a war zone, if that becomes a place that is dangerous, if that becomes a place that is subject to an unexpected kind of destructive moment like that, it's a very, very difficult thing to grapple with. And if you don't have a support system around you, whether you're a regular citizen or whether you're a journalist or whoever you are, if you don't have a support system around you that you can discuss this with, if you don't have a way that you can process those emotions, you know, I saw friends completely fall apart because they just couldn't grapple with it and they didn't know how. And it's a different process than when you're grappling with what you cover. It's a very, very different, it's a different process than going to a war zone and seeing violence and trying to grapple with the difficulty of seeing, you know, families fleeing, of seeing children crying, of seeing people who are wounded. That's something that is, you know, is something that that you kind of prepare yourself for when you go. And then there's the other set of emotions, which I think we deal with really well in this book, which was like a surprise to me, which are the emotions that I think a lot of women will feel in these kinds of contexts and conflict zones that I think our male colleagues don't necessarily feel as strongly as we do, or maybe their experiences aren't shaped as strongly by them. These are feelings of doubt. These are feelings of imposter syndrome. These are feelings of inadequacy, being self-conscious, you know, being worried about sources taking advantage of you, et cetera, because of being a woman. Through the process of writing this book, I understood that the emotions that we go through when we're covering a conflict zone or living in an area that's a bit tense, it's not just about the physical threat that might come from an explosion or the physical threat that we think might come from the risk of kidnapping or whatever. It's really this kind of constant feeling that we're not living up to the expectations of male colleagues, or that we're not living up to the standards that have been set by male colleagues, and that we have to constantly make up for it because people kind of look at us as being a little bit strange that we're in that place. I mean, you know, the number of times that I was looked at as kind of like, what is this woman doing here? You know, in the middle of like Western Iraq or in the middle of like a militia base or wherever. That weighs on you eventually. I mean, and I'm sure that there are a lot of women who are probably in this room now who kind of understand that look that you get where you're like, what are you doing here? You know, you don't belong here. To end on a positive note, to end my rambling on a positive note, I haven't slept in 36 hours, so please forgive me for my jumping around. It is changing. I mean, when I think about the number of women that I would see, that I saw when I was covering my first conflict zone, which was Mosul, and then going to Raqqa, and then going to Deir ez-Zor after that, it's incredible. I mean, that's over the course of, That's over the course of 2 years. Very, very short time span. But the percentage and the kind of the number of women that we're covering, the share of reporters that were women on the ground grew exponentially. And it makes a huge, huge difference when you're a woman reporter on the ground and you look around and you see that you have other leading reporters who are also women. It makes you more comfortable, but it also makes you feel like you have something to look forward to. You're not just kind of wading into a sea of male reporters and kind of having to navigate that. You see that actually it's an industry that you belong in and that you can consider yourself to plan for a future in as well. So I think that changes. I think that it changes every emotional process that you go through when you see that you have other women who are experiencing something similar, and you have the network that you can access to discuss every kind of range of emotion that we discuss in this book.
That's what happened during the process of writing this book. That I forgot to mention that all the ladies here wrote this book during the pandemic. So it was a time of worries, but at the same time it was a time of healing and somehow, and healing and dealing with the present, with the past, with emotions and everything. Thanks, Maya, for mentioning one point of discussion that this morning was run during the panel about freelancing and safety for journalists. We said that is quite different covering an event like the blast in Beirut or conflict or whatever, where you are not part of that society, where your family is not there. When your family, you belong to that place. the feeling is different. Even though you are the most empathic person on earth, but there is something different. And that's why also this book is important, because the voices are not only the voices of women that choose to live in somewhere, but also voices of women that live in the countries that they had to leave those countries for many reasons, and they were fixing for other colleagues. Talking about Aman, she's Egyptian, and Kabat Habas is Kurdish. So this is like, you know, a way of talking about this topic in a comprehensive way. Dealing about emotions means also dealing with the bounds that these emotions leave on us, or the bounds that these emotions are in the people we meet. And so this subject is something that always is, you know, we try to skip it, don't talk in public, we are ashamed of it. I'm talking about post-traumatic stress disorder, but not only the consequences of these emotions on us, but when you have to deal with people and meeting people who experience horrible things like tortures or trafficking, etc. So Nancy covered for many years Libya. It's her second home, we can say. She met a lot of people, migrants, women who were tortured in the prisons after being trafficked from the south of Africa to sub-Saharan Africa to Libya. So often we don't like to admit that there's a price to pay for this job, getting post-traumatic stress disorder, and we can say that women correspondents are more open to speaking on this regard, but at the same time we have to take this into account when we interview victims like you did. So what was your experience in Libya, Nancy, in this regard?
Thank you, Laura, for the question. Yeah, well, it's very important to talk about post-traumatic disorder syndrome, because it's something that I think is really spread, but it's underreported, because as war journalists we are supposed to be like heroes, but we are not. We are human beings that just try to do their job, to report, and actually you need to feed people to report what they feel. No? Otherwise we wouldn't even be good at our job. I would say that what really breaks your emotions, at least this is my experience, is not the tortures or the stories that they tell you about what they've been through, but mainly the idea that those people have no future. At least this is my experience. Why? Because then you start to feel guilty over the idea that you have, as we say in our code, we have the red passport, which is the European one, and anytime you can hit the road and go. While those people that you are sharing with for few moments, the suffering, they are going to stay. And it's that moment that you can't take the weight of the emotions. Like you can try to report, take notes, tell them, I will tell the word, but you know that in the end you are going to go. And I think that the difference between other journalists that report war zones and us as a small group of colleagues, and especially those war reporters that Natalia picked up one by one, is exactly that we are based in the region. Well, in my case, I used to be based in the region and afterwards I moved to Europe. Although I'm a kind of special case because I got married to my fixer. So in the end, I brought with me a little part of Libya, and I keep bearing the consequences of my work, my journalistic work, because I still have in the house, Libyan problems break into the house daily, because we have part of the family there, and so on and so forth. But again, for me, Libya at a certain point was home, and it's a totally different world from Europe. It's true, but what I tried always to explain Libyans that were astonishing how I could live on my own in Libya just as journalist, and I'm a freelancer, so I was not even there for a big company that would give me big salary or security team. I was just on my own. They used to wonder, how can you bear all this weight just to report? And they thought, of course, this was the first reaction, that I was from the intelligence, also because it was straight after the revolution. They were not used to freelancers. We were starting to get into the field, we were kind of new player in the information landscape. And I knew that even some of my best friends, till the end, didn't know if I was a spy or a journalist. They kept playing on this, they kept playing this job, like, come on, Nancy, better than us Libyans, Libya, because actually I traveled to Libya more than any ordinary Libyan would do. But what happened, that I used to tell them, listen, I'm European, but don't forget that I'm from south of Italy. And for me, this is very important because I guess that what my contemporaries go through nowadays is exactly what my grandparents used to tell me about. So it's just a matter of generations. I don't perceive myself from a totally different world. I feel that it's Mediterranean, so I could connect many stories that I used to cover on the ground. And for me, there was a real, sincere sharing. And when I see the revolution hope unfolding just before me, I started to really suffer because they were my friends. When I started to see the bombs dropping, on their heads, for me it was a shock. Like, why those guys and girls that are even political activists, they are the best part of the society, they are the civil society, they are going to get killed, and they don't have the red passport to go. So for me, it was really hard to interact with them, because in the end of the day, I had the opportunity to leave, although I stayed long, and I started at a certain point even just, I worked mainly on the social level of Libya, because as I usually say, in general, the mainstream Libya don't talk about, they talk about Libya, not about Libyans. And there is a very big difference. If you talk about Libya, you report about the country in terms of geopolitics, but in this picture, Libyans are not there. They are just absent. They are missing. And I tried to return a picture of Libyans. Who are Libyans? They are not all traffickers. They are not traffickers by their DNA. Actually, it's just a strategic area. They are the gate, the African gate to Europe. So there is an opportunity there, especially when the country turns into a war zone. So there is the war economy that takes over. But it's just the mafia, It's just like, for us as Italians, we are told like, all Italians are mafia people. No, even migrants, for instance, when they talk badly about Libyans, and I meet them here, because of course I've been going back and forth with prisons in Libya, when I have the opportunity to talk with migrants that went through Libya here in Italy, and we started to talk slowly, they get relaxed. They admit that Libyans are very generous people because there is the mafia, and mafia has one color all over the world, you know, and if you are irregular, not for your fault because of politics and the migration policy, of course, but if you are irregular for your bad luck, it's not bad luck, it's politics, you are obliged to go through certain channels that are run by mafia, you know, and mafia is mafia. They carry guns, weapons, but if you deal with an ordinary Libyan, actually they are very far away from the violence attitude. Now they've started, you know, to get used to violence, because this is when the country stays at war for long, even the culture changes. But back to the post-trauma disorder, yeah, I went through post-trauma disorder because at a certain point I started to feel the need. Back then I was the only journalist based in the country, and then there were colleagues going back and forth. And there was the United Nations dialogue, national dialogue process that was picking up representatives from the factions here and there with no criteria or unknown criteria, like for the representation itself. So there were people on the ground that didn't feel represented from the people sitting around the table of the negotiations. And unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know, I started to be approached by Libyans that asked me to be a kind of an ambassador for them to the UN. And I started to feel this weight, this responsibility. So I think that I crashed, because actually you don't know exactly how to tell the diplomatic personnel that those people should have their say in the story. But actually, who has the say? The international media that keeps talking about Libya and traffickers, which is totally misleading narrative. There are no Libyans there. So I think that this is, the main breaking point for me while I was working on the ground, because the responsibility of reporting stories that otherwise would go untold was too strong. And probably as freelancer, I was not well equipped and trained. And I think that that's why we have to address this issue. We need to prepare ourselves. There is, then I've got to know that there is this file, this class that you should attend when you work for UN, that is called Pointlessness of a Volunteer. Meaning that when you start to volunteer with UN and to work for NGOs, you should bear into your mind that your work is not going to produce necessarily a change, and you have to learn how to cope with that. Probably even us as freelancers, as journalists, we should learn how to deal with the idea that we can put how much effort as we can, but still we might be disillusioned from the reality, and we should know how to deal with that weight, because no, it's not easy emotionally wise, and we are humans.
Thank you, Nancy, for highlighting this topic. We understood that we are not intimidated at all by the tribal system, right? But maybe the idea of changing something, contributing to change something in societies who are broken from the core, and understanding that our reporting can't make the difference sometimes, well, is something we have to deal with. So you mentioned a keyword, responsibility. And I would like to ask Natalia to go deeper into that and into the chapters written by Al-Jalal and Kabat Habas, and tell us how was their contribution, how this contribution made a difference to this book. I just want to about responsibility, and you mentioned before passports, the possibility to go back and forth from certain countries. I really appreciate very much the fact that a man that actually is living in Europe, so she's a migrant from a different direction, lose her mother during this process. And this chapter is really heartbreaking because when you you make some choices and you are far from people, your family, and you realize that you are not doing, what is you're supposed to do, being beside your beloved when comes the time. It's something really heartbreaking, something difficult to deal with. So I will ask Natalia to be the voice of a man and Kabat at this moment.
Thank you, Laura. So yes, just to say a couple of words about our colleagues who cannot be here today. And one is Khabat Abbas. She's Syrian from the Kurdish region of the Northeast. She is an independent journalist and video producer, and she has been covering, let's say, all the raising, stagnation, and decline of the Islamic State in that area. And Iman Hilal, she is Egyptian, she's a photographer, also independent photographer. She was covering all the prisons and protests and the so-called revolution in Egypt in 2011 to topple Mubarak. And of course, it was not easy being a woman, being a veiled woman, covering violence on the streets, even during the era of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was not an easy task for her. And she was one of the few female photographers covering all these events. And now, as you mentioned, she's in Germany, which it was a very interesting part. And this is why on the editing process and the bilateral conversations that I have, I was very keen that she include this part of how she is living, because she also did a trip to the US, and she mentions her coverage in the US among Muslim communities and her experience in Germany. And it's kind of the inverse, the opposite that Kata, Nancy, and I were experiencing in living in the Middle East as foreigners, with all the stereotypes and prejudice that will come to us as women, as foreign women, which they don't know in which kind of category to put us, but there are some prejudice about it. And she came to get the inverse side of it. One of the passages on her account, she said that she was going on the bicycle and smiling because she always wanted to learn to ride a bicycle, something she couldn't do in Egypt. And when she finally does it in Germany, passerbys were looking strange to her just because she has a piece of tissue over her head. And the image was not clear for them to have a veiled woman going into a bicycle. So she experienced all these rejections, and somehow when she's trying to do her work here, while she also have difficulties while implementing her work over there. So I guess the responsibility is very different for our colleagues who are from the ground. First of all, is another generation. If we compare, I mean, they are younger because they are inserting now all these kind of hub of new journalism who are raised in the Middle East, because unfortunately most of the Arab countries have been under the press and the media in the Middle East and North Africa has been always a propaganda tool for governments. So now you have this new generation who is born on the Arab Spring who are reporting, and among them you have young ladies, young women who are doing it also for the first time and who are including in a different layer what changes are happening to their own society. Because we are talking about what Arab women are doing, but they are talking about what the sister fellow Arab women are doing inside the society and directed to their own communities, be it Syria in the case of Rabat, or be it Egyptian in the case of Iman. And it's very difficult to detach yourself. Same for us, the foreigners who, by the way, the three of us married with local guys at some point. we get this complexity and we get embedded in the society, but at some point we can leave. For them, is their society, is their families, is their friends. In the case of Khabat Abbas, it's also, maybe I always say, when talking about the book, that she's the one who has lost the most in this war. We mentioned Iman has to leave from distance. She didn't have time to go back to see her mother when she was dying. She just have to arrive after. This has happened on the other way also to some of our colleagues also here present, that we cannot have time to go back to our homes to see our mothers because we were immersed in this coven of the Middle East. So it happened both ways. But Khabat, she also lost a brother. And for her, through the book, it's easy to discover all this constant argument with herself on how to be a journalist when you are in a country and how to be neutral when you have a brother fighting with armed group who is trying to stop the advance of the Islamic State and to stop the ravaging of his fellow citizens. So it's a very different debate that she brings to the table about the responsibility of telling what is happening on, the responsibility towards her own community, and how to be neutral when you are reporting that a radical group, terrorist group, is killing your brother in this case, which he has to mourn with it, but the rest of your community, the survival is at stake. So in this case, I think responsibilities are different. As Nancy mentioned, for us, there is always also this debate of feeling guilty that we can leave, but we're still there. So for them, I think is a little bit deeper. Is their people, is their home, and that's the one they have.
Yes, it's harder, definitely. Thanks, Natalia, for bringing here the voice of Eman and Kabat somehow. And I have one question for all of you, and we try to make it short, the answer, because we want to listen to your questions, the questions from the audience. But I just want to say this something I used to say when people ask, okay, is it hard doing journalism, being a woman in Middle East? Is it difficult? Okay, can you report about? And I used to answer, I said, well, no, because we as journalists and with double nationalities or other nationalities, because this makes the difference a lot, we are the third sex. And people say, what does it mean, third sex? Third sex is, kind of strange object or subject, depends on the views, that can have access definitely to all the world of the women, where men, foreign men especially, but men can't, especially in certain environments. I'm talking about like tribal system, Libya, Yemen, and so on. But also men in these regions are very curious about women reporting coming from abroad. So in my personal experience, I didn't have problems in general being rejected or something like that, unless something political happens, and this is a problem in case. So, but I want to ask you, all of you, if you can mention a story, a short story that, in your opinion, a male reporter could never reach, or something strange that you notice in some reports of you that maybe was impossible to do or have access to a man. Maybe I will start with Nancy, because Nancy has a story, just something
let's say that
quite curious.
My being a woman in Middle East and North Africa North Africa region in general is might be seen as an asset. Why? Because let's say that you are perceived as not a threat. There is this perception of a woman as a subject to protect, that is not going to hurt you. So very often they are more open to let you in, even for, I'm talking about sources. But in general, I would say that in 2 cases, my gender really made a difference. Once in Libya, a smuggler, and not trafficker, a smuggler. We became friends. I also stayed. I stayed in his house for a month, covering the story. Human smuggler. And I remember that at a certain point he told me, I asked, I dared my luck, and I asked, can I live with migrants on board? And he told me, listen, Nancy, if you were a male, yes, but you are a woman. I would never forgive myself if something happens to you as you are a woman. And I was, please, come on, really don't say so. I'm a journalist, I'm not a woman, I'm a journalist. I really wanna, I'm thirsty of this story. Anyway, no way, he didn't let me on board. On the other hand, in Iraq, very close in the south of Mosul, there is a woman that is called Hanadi, and she's the leader of a Shia militia, although she's Sunni. But anyhow, the political frame is always very interesting. She's very known in the region because she beheaded ISIS militiamen. Basically, after she killed them, she beheaded them and she cooked their heads in the kitchen, And she has, of course, her reputation is very bad. You can understand that, no? And at a certain point, I decided to go to visit her, to look for her. And I managed to reach her somewhere. She was in a village that were isolated. All around there were ISIS men. And basically that night, first of all, my impact with her was pretty smooth. She took me to the cemetery where there were the tombs, the graveyards of basically all her family's members that were killed by ISIS and terrorists. So I understood that basically this woman was nothing than traumatized woman. Of course, her reaction are not stable, But if you talk to her, you would find a kind of rational person. I asked her, obviously, why you did it. Why did you beheaded some corpses, because they were already dead, and you cooked their heads? And she told me, I wanted just to prove that I don't respect them. They have no respect, and I treat them even worse than I would treat animals. It was her way to put it. Anyway, why Laura pulled me into this story? Because that night, again, we were in the middle of nowhere. All the area was surrounded by ISIS militiamen. And the day before the night where I was, the day before I arrived, there was also, they also broke in from the river, and they killed some kids in their bed. So the spot was very dangerous. She offered me to sleep with her in her room. And everybody got astonished, a lot of colleagues, even female colleagues. Nancy, did you actually sleep with her in her bedroom? To be honest with you, in that moment, her bedroom, sounded to me as the safest place all around. So I slept with her. We put our pajama on and we slept. Yeah, I know. I slept with somebody that cooked ISIS man heads. But for me, it was totally natural, and we spoke a lot. She wore, my grandmother flip-flop. It's just like a different, dimension, I would say. But again, you just forget about the character. You try to see the person with all her traumas, because of course she's traumatized, and her actions are something that should be also accounted. She should be accountable for what she did, but that area doesn't know for a while now what's the justice,
Sure. Well, if Humanadi wasn't real, she's really a character. But don't worry, she doesn't own a restaurant, right? This is quite important. We have 7 minutes. I don't know if you want to answer to this question. Otherwise, we will open the floor. I think we have time for one question.
Yeah, I think it's better because I think the stories are similar.
Sure.
There are plenty, but there's more.
Others, Hanadi in Iran or in Lebanon. Okay, there's a question. We can't give you a microphone, but please you have to shout, and I will repeat your question. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sure, we will hear you.
No, I have a question to Nancy about what you asked the smuggler to do the trip, right? Yeah. How do you? You knew, of course, that thing was very risky for your life, but you would do anyway because of your job, how do you find the balance between risking your life, you are sure that you were risking your life and your job? Because I don't really, I'm not very clear on that, but I was very, shocked about your request, and I really admire the courage, but how do you feel that?
Yeah, I have to repeat the question for the streaming. So the question is, how did you balance in many situations, specifically in this one where you asked a smuggler to get into a boat, between risking your life and at the end reporting? Why is this worth it?
Well, I always say that at least in my case, I'm not courageous at all, meaning that I don't perceive my vocation to the job, to journalism, as a proof of courage. For instance, I would never ride a motorbike. I'm really scared. I feel that I'm going to die anytime. So it's really not a matter of courage. It's just your vocation. When you have a vocation, you see the things in a different perspective. Of course, you have to consider the risk. You have to count the risk. It's not that you are just getting to go. But let's say that the risk is very much calculated. I would not get on board with somebody that I don't trust, meaning that I know that it's not, I would not have a guarantee for the trip, for the safety, but at the same time, I know that man, I know how he works, and I know which proportion between the people and the boat, and so on and so forth. Of course, when you do this job, you have to take the risk, but it's not courage. It's just your vocation to report about extreme, you want to report extreme stories, not because you have a sense of cynic touch, but just because I can tell wherever you have, you walk on the line between death and life, the best, very often, not always, but the best of humanity comes out, meaning that you really feel the person that is beside you, and at a certain point, you are a journalist, you take notes, but you share that experience, you are really there, and you laugh, you cry, you leave that spot with the other people as companions. I don't perceive myself as journalist, and as long as my eyes come across the kids' eyes, for me, I'm on the same boat.
So it is worth it. This is the answer. Well, we are running out of time, so we have 1 minute to to thank you, everyone for coming. And if you have any question, you can talk with the speakers outside of the venue. And I repeat that, Balas Para Todas is an amazing room brought by these aspiring ladies, Natalia Sanchez, Nancy Porcia, Catalina Gomez-Angel, and Maya Jebeli. Thanks everyone for coming.
And of course, just add that you should find some copies, even if interested, in at the library shop Feltrinelli, bookshop Feltrinelli. We managed to get some copies there.
Okay, thanks for coming.